My name is Andrew Senior, and I'm a Genetic Technologist in the All Wales Medical Genomics Service. I've been working for the service for nearly 5 years now. I think the biggest change was the genomic strategy for Wales, which came in shortly after I started in the service, and I've seen a lot of the manifestations of that strategy during my time here. With a lot of the technology we've been able to acquire and the services we've been able to deliver, which is still ongoing. I think it's the single largest change to genomics in Wales in decades. Well, the role of a genetic technologist can vary between technologists, but in a nutshell, the role of a genetic technologist is to perform all of the technical work associated with genetic laboratory test. Really, you can break that down into a few components, really, and that can be the wet work that's done in the laboratory. It can be operating the laboratory instruments to analyse those samples, and then the analysis itself, which is taking the data and then looking at that. And then, depending on the size of the service that we're working on and how many patients may be maybe going ahead for testing in that service, you may do one or all of those things within your day-to-day. At the moment, I'm working on a test that tests the suitability of acute myeloid leukemia patients for certain therapies. And if they come up with a certain mutational variant, then we can then issue that therapy to that patient, and it can have quite a dramatic effect on their prognosis. So my day-to-day really is that I would come in the morning and I would then get the paperwork, pick up the extracted samples which have been extracted by the associate practitioners. Then I would perform a process called a PCR, which is a polymerase chain reaction. All that is effectively is we're taking the small amount of DNA that we've extracted from that sample and made hundreds of thousands of copies of that same material. And by doing that, it allows us to test it and be able to get a stronger signal when we add chemicals to it, long and short, really. Then after that, I would run what we call a slab gel. That really just tells us the quality of whether the PCR has worked, and if there's any contamination. It's a quality step for part of our quality control process. And then following that, I would then commence the preparation of that sample to be then put onto the sequencer. In my particular role, I work with a gene sequencer called a pyrosequencer, which is very different to other platforms of NGS because it can pick up very specific regions of DNA with very, very good clarity and reliability, and it's also quite cost effective in comparison to other platforms. So at the moment, the work that I'm dealing with is largely to do with patients who are wanting to be tested through the NHS, but we're also taking on some work from trials and working in conjunction with Cardiff Uni with that as well. So I studied biomedical science in Cardiff Metropolitan University, and that gave me a very broad understanding of laboratory medicine as a whole. And from that I went into a generic laboratory medicine role. I did want to move into genetics if it was at all possible, but what I found at the time was that the field was quite obscure to me, and I appreciate that from the outside it can seem a little bit like looking into a fog, because I don't know, perhaps there's not very much news from the inside, and hopefully this video will fix that a little bit. There are many ways to get to where I am. Some people would even say that perhaps there isn't even a clear direction to do it, but the way I did it was perhaps the most conventional way, in the sense that I started work in laboratory medicine as a Band 2 medical laboratory assistant in the main pathology lab of University Hospital. There it was largely a clerical role, and from there I gained a lot of experience about the quality associated with laboratory practice, which really then allowed me to enter into genetics as a medical technical officer, which is a Band 3 post in cytogenetics. And from there, then I worked my way up through the department here at the All Wales Medical Genomics Service. I shortly became an associate practitioner here and was performing that role, doing mostly PCR protocols for about 2 years. and then about 6 months ago I was promoted to a genetic technologist. The most rewarding aspect of working not just in this role but for the All Wales Medical Genomics Service is to be part of the genomics strategy for Wales. With the influx of funding that we've had in this lab, we've been very lucky because we've been able to upgrade a lot of our existing infrastructure and our testing abilities to acquire especially instruments that are cutting edge really, and really giving us the cutting edge in competition with England but also overseas. And having the opportunity to work with this sort of equipment and do these sort of tests is really invaluable, especially in a field of medicine that's expanding so rapidly that you can easily see which technologies and which platforms are going to be the ones that are going to pave the way forward. So in that regard, I think it's really great to be part of that and to be sort of surfing that wave, if you know what I mean, as we move forward. I would say don't be content don't allow yourself to be content in the thought that you don't have anything left to learn. Especially in this field, which is rapidly expanding, there's always something to learn. And you can do a procedure 100 times and you can still have something to learn. Because this field is rapidly expanding, and like I said, we are working at the forefront of the genetic technologies in some capacities. It's not uncommon for you to feel like you don't know a certain aspect of what it is you need to do to fix a problem perhaps, but your peers will also be in a similar position. So what I would say is don't be afraid to think outside the box to try and fix those problems and gather more information from a broader perspective. I don't think that I would have been able to get to where I am without the support of my colleagues, and that comes from the support that I was given in planning my career, and down to the daily sort of can you check my work, can you make sure I'm doing this correctly, or can you remind me how this is done, is it 3 microliters or is it 5 microliters, and that constant support is, I think, what makes us so successful. So much more work with Wales Gene Park now. We're working closely with Cardiff University and a number of other business partners across Wales, and that's only getting bigger as a project now with the Genomics Partnership for Wales. So I would say look up anything to do with what Wales Gene Park are doing, Pengu, look up anything to do with what we're doing, because there's so many projects that we are currently doing to expand our test directory and try and test new means of testing. So looking into the WINGS project, as for example, as whole genome sequencing. It's very exciting stuff. So these little projects will give you an idea of where the field is going, and then from that you can kind of work your way backwards to figure out what it is that we currently do. And I think that will give you a very clear picture of what genomics is in Wales at the minute, so that you can point yourself towards it. It was quite difficult, I think, being distant from a lot of your colleagues and having to try and implement that 2-meter distancing rule when a lot of your work hinges on people checking your work and being close to you and being over your shoulder, So it required a lot of us to adapt in ways that we never really thought we would before. But it's also impressive to see how resourceful the department has been to be able to put those measures in place for us, so that we are afforded the safest working environment while at the same time being able to deliver the service as per usual. I love to travel. I think it's important for anyone to travel, really. I think it's one thing to gain knowledge in a job like this, but you really gain wisdom by travelling the world. So I've been all over, really. So I tend to do long stints of work in the laboratory, and get my head down and do what I can for the patients, and then my free time, it's Japan or France or anywhere really that takes my interest. I'm a keen cyclist as well. I'm trying to cycle a little bit more. Probably should be a little bit fitter, but yeah. In 5 years' time, there are a number of options available, you know, for me to pursue. One of which is to go into clinical scientist training. My colleague Sian Lewis did that. She's recently finished and become a fully qualified clinical scientist, and it's a fully funded course on the NHS that will last about 3 years. And at the end of it, you get a master's degree and you become a qualified clinical scientist, and that then is also progression in your career as well. Another aspect that I'm also quite enthused to look at is to move up into the management side of things from the technical perspective, because coming from a technical background, I really do thrive in this sort of work, and being able to manage my own team, especially in a place like this, I do enjoy working with a lot of the people here. I think it would be great to move into a position like that.